This turtle chocolate cake has layers of my favorite moist chocolate cake, a rich caramel buttercream, caramel in between the cake layers, and chopped pecans. It's like those little turtle candies but in cake form. Lots of amazing flavors, lots of great texture. It's an amazing cake and I know you're gonna love it. Hi, I'm Lindsay from Life, Love, and Sugar, and today we're making a turtle chocolate cake. So the first thing we're going to do is make our caramel sauce. So we'll head over to the stove and get that started. Okay, so to your pan, you're going to want to add your sugar and some water. And then we're going to turn this stove on to about medium-low and let it just kind of sit. We can stir it a little bit, but we just want the sugar to melt. All right, so when your sugar is melted, we're gonna go ahead and add the butter and get that melted. Okay, so now that the butter is melted, we're gonna turn the heat up to medium, and we're not gonna stir it at all. We're just gonna let it sit and simmer for maybe about 20 minutes. You wanna look for a golden amber color that'll help you know that it's ready. So just let it go. All right, so after it's been cooking for a while, you'll start to see that it's getting kind of a caramely color to it, and that's what you want. But you want to keep letting it go for a while because you really want it to deepen. There's not really a wrong amount of time to let it cook for, except if you burn it, but you really want to let it sit long enough that you get a deep caramel flavor. All right, so we're kind of getting a rich amber color here, a nice caramel. And you can really push this as far as you like, just don't burn it. I like to push it as far as I can because I really like a deep caramel flavor. But you can see it's getting nice and dark, and so we're gonna go ahead and take it off the heat and kind of slowly add our heavy whipping cream. It's gonna bubble up quite a bit and steam, so be careful. And as it starts to settle and cool down a little, those bubbles will subside. We can add in our vanilla extract and our salt. And now we have our lovely, delicious caramel sauce. So we will go ahead and let it sit and come to room temperature so that we can use it in our cake later. To get started with this chocolate cake, we're gonna mix our dry ingredients together. So we've got our sugar and some all-purpose flour, our cocoa powder, some baking soda, and salt. And we'll whisk all this together. To that, we're going to add our wet ingredients. We've got eggs and milk and vegetable oil. All right, now we'll just whisk all those together. And then we'll add our hot or boiling water and some vanilla extract. And we'll stir all this together. It will be a very thin cake batter, so don't be alarmed. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. It doesn't get any easier than that. So now we're going to put our cake batter and divide it into our cake pans. All right, so to prepare my cake pans, I like to just spray the sides with a baking spray, a nonstick spray, and then I'll put parchment circles in the bottom. And then you want to divide the cake batter evenly between the cake pans. I like to use my food scale just so that I know that they're completely even and they'll bake evenly in the oven. All right, so now that we've got our cake batter and our cake pans, we're going to go ahead and pop these in the oven. They'll bake for about 30 minutes. So once your cakes have baked and cooled and you're ready to make your frosting, we're going to go ahead and make the caramel frosting. We've got our butter. We're going to add that to our mixer, and we'll go ahead and mix this together until it's nice and smooth. All right, so that's looking good, so we'll go ahead and start adding our powdered sugar. It is quite a bit of powdered sugar. It's an American-style buttercream. The powdered sugar adds both volume and stability to your frosting, and we'll go ahead and add about half of it. All right, so when that's looking pretty well combined and smooth, we're gonna go ahead and start adding our caramel sauce. And then add about half a cup to start, and then we can always add more later to get the right consistency and the right amount of caramel flavor. Stir that in. All right, so now we'll start adding the rest of our powdered sugar. All right, so assuming that you use that full amount of powdered sugar, you should notice that your frosting is pretty thick at this point. So we're gonna add more caramel sauce to our buttercream to kind of start thinning it out and add more flavor. But as we start seeing it thin out, we don't wanna add too much at a time or we might thin it out too much. We want to make sure that our buttercream has enough caramel sauce in it that you're getting that nice flavor, but that it's thick enough that it's going to hold your cake together well, because we're actually going to use this frosting to pipe a dam around the outside of our cake, and that will hold our caramel sauce in place. So if your frosting isn't thick enough, then it's not going to stay in place and your caramel sauce won't stay in place and everything's going to just kind of out of your cake. Nobody wants that. So we want to make sure this is plenty thick enough, which is why that amount of powdered sugar is kind of necessary. All right, so when you're ready to build your cake, we're going to start by trimming the domes off of our cake layers so that all of our caramel sauce and everything that we're putting in between the layers stays in place. Okay, so now that all our cake layers are level, we're going to go ahead and start adding the filling. We're going to start with some caramel frosting, about 2/3 a cup, and spread that into an even layer. The next thing we want to do is add our caramel sauce. To do that, we're going to first pipe a dam around the edge of the cake. So I'm going to use a piping bag with a large round tip. And we will add half a cup of caramel sauce. Now if your dam is sitting up above the caramel sauce a little bit, you want to level that out. And then we'll add some pecans. And then we'll add our next layer of cake. And now we're just going to repeat the caramel frosting, the dam, the caramel sauce, and the pecans again. Right, now it's time to add our final layer of cake on top. Okay, so now that we have our cake built, we're going to add a thin layer of frosting to the outside, usually called a crumb coat. It holds in a lot of the crumbs so that they don't get into your frosting at the end when we add that final layer of frosting. Just go ahead and add a thin layer on top and then we'll be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this into the fridge for half an hour, maybe an hour, just until it firms up a little bit. All right, so now that our cake has chilled for a little while, it's time to frost the outside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and add roughly a cup of frosting on the top of the cake. All right, now I'll smooth this into an even layer. Now to frost the sides, I like to use the Wilton Tip 789 to actually apply the frosting to the sides of my cake and then smooth it out. All right, now I will use my icing smoother to smooth out the sides. For more detail on how I frost my cakes, you could actually check out my video on how to frost a smooth cake with buttercream. Okay, so now that we've got our cake frosted, we're gonna go ahead and make our chocolate ganache that we'll put on top. So to make our chocolate ganache, we're gonna wanna heat up our heavy cream until it just starts to boil, and then we'll pour that over our chocolate chips. Let it sit for a couple minutes and allow it to melt our chocolate down. So now we're going to give this a whisk until it gets nice and smooth. The cream should have melted down those chocolate chips. All right, so now we'll go ahead and add the drip to our cake. All right, and then we'll fill in the middle with what's left. So now that we've got our chocolate drip on here, the final thing we'll want to do is add some frosting swirls on top, maybe a drizzle of caramel and a few more pecans, and then you're ready to go. So I'm using the Ateco 844 tip, but you could use something similar as well. For the caramel drizzle, you could also use a squeeze bottle just like we did for the chocolate, or you could just use a spoon and keep it simple and just kind of drizzle it across the top of the cake. And this caramel is at about room temperature. We'll sprinkle a few pecans. And now you have your turtle chocolate cake. It is an amazing chocolate cake full of caramel and pecans. It's absolutely delicious. I know you're gonna love it. For the full recipe, head over to lifeloveandsugar.com.